The bystander effect. The bystander effect is a social response pattern in which individuals become less likely to intervene in an emergency when more people are present. The core mechanism behind this behavior is diffusion of responsibility. When a person is alone, they perceive themselves as the sole responsible agent, which activates immediate decision-making. When many people are present, the responsibility is mentally distributed among the group, lowering the perceptual urgency for any single person to act. The effect strengthens when the situation is ambiguous. If observers are unsure whether an event is dangerous or requires intervention, they scan the reactions of others. If everyone appears passive, each person interprets the passivity as evidence that help is not required. This creates a feedback loop in which hesitation reinforces more hesitation. As a result, a crowd can remain still even when assistance would be simple or safe to provide. Social evaluation also contributes. Individuals often hesitate because they do not want to make an incorrect judgment or appear overreactive in front of others. This cognitive risk assessment slows response times further, especially in public settings, where witnesses are unfamiliar with one another. In extreme cases, entire groups have remained inactive during events such as public assaults or medical emergencies. These events illustrate that the bystander effect can override instinctive reactions like helping someone in visible distress. The transcript describes situations where onlookers behave as though they are in an idle state, unable to initiate an action until externally prompted. The combination of responsibility diffusion, social referencing, and fear of misjudgment produces a predictable but counterintuitive response. The larger the crowd, the smaller the chance that anyone will intervene. Déjà vu. Déjà vu is a perceptual error in which the brain briefly interprets a new experience as a memory. The sensation occurs when the neural systems responsible for recognizing familiarity activate at the wrong time, creating the illusion that the present moment has already been lived. Under normal functioning, the brain separates incoming sensory information into two channels, one that processes current experience and one that checks for stored matches in memory. In a déjà vu event, these channels momentarily desynchronize, and the familiarity circuit fires without an actual past event to reference. This misfire produces a specific feeling: the conviction that the unfolding moment is a replay. Individuals often report accurately predicting what will happen next, not because they have seen it before, but because the sensation of familiarity is powerful enough to create an expectation of repetition. The brain fills in possible outcomes using pattern recognition, which can feel like foresight. Temporal processing errors also contribute. Sensory inputs sometimes reach the brain's memory handling regions a fraction of a second earlier than the systems responsible for conscious awareness. When this occurs, the brain interprets the delayed conscious perception as a second occurrence of the same event, creating the illusion of reliving a moment that is still happening for the first time. Additional interpretations arise because déjà vu feels unusually vivid. The transcript describes how the sensation can feel precise and predictive, leading some to believe that the experience reflects a non-linear interaction with time or a memory from an alternate version of events. The core mechanism, however, is a misclassification of the present as a memory due to temporary synchronization errors in neural processing. The missing footage. Missing time refers to a gap in conscious memory in which a person becomes aware that a measurable period has passed without any corresponding recollection. The transcript describes this as a desynchronization of the mental recording system. The clock advances normally, but the subjective timeline contains no content for the missing interval. One explanation is highway hypnosis, a state that occurs during repetitive or low-stimulus activities, such as long-distance driving. In this state, attention narrows and the brain shifts into automatic processing. Sensory information continues to be registered, but the memory systems responsible for forming detailed episodic memories sharply reduce activity. As a result, long stretches of time can pass without forming clear recollections. However, the transcript notes that missing time can occur in situations unrelated to driving, such as while cleaning, watching television, or even mid-conversation. In these cases, the mechanism is closer to a brief dissociative lapse. Dissociation reduces self-awareness and interrupts the continuous integration of sensory information into a coherent timeline. When the person returns to full awareness, the memory gap becomes noticeable because external markers, such as the position of the sun or the time on a clock, no longer match the subjective sense of duration. These lapses can also occur when attention becomes deeply absorbed in internal thought. When cognitive load is directed inward, the brain may deprioritize external stimuli, weakening the encoding of real-time events. Because episodic memory relies on structured, sequential input, any interruption in encoding produces a blank interval rather than a compressed summary. The defining feature of missing time is not simply lost memory, but the absence of any internal narrative that explains the elapsed duration. The Mandela Effect. The Mandela Effect occurs when large groups of people share the same incorrect memory about an event, object, or detail. The transcript gives several examples, such as the belief that Pikachu has a black tip on his tail, or that the Monopoly mascot wears a monocle. In both cases, the remembered details do not exist in any official version, yet millions recall them with confidence. The core mechanism behind this effect is reconstructive memory. Human memory does not store events as complete recordings. Instead, the brain saves fragments and later reconstructs missing details using logic, association, and prior knowledge. When these reconstruction processes align across many individuals, large groups may form the same false memory. For instance, a monocle fits the stereotype of a wealthy character, making it an easy detail for the brain to generate even if it was never present. Social reinforcement strengthens these errors. When one person confidently describes a memory, others may adopt it through suggestion or by assuming they simply forgot the detail. Over time, repetition transforms the invented detail into a widely accepted version of the event. Because memory confidence does not correlate with accuracy, people often feel certain about memories that formed through this reconstruction process. The transcript also references the widespread belief that Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 1980s, even though he survived and later became president of South Africa before dying in the year 2013. This large-scale false recollection demonstrates how collective narratives can overwrite factual timelines. Another factor is memory schema. Schemas are organizational frameworks that help the brain categorize information. When a new detail fits an existing schema, the brain may integrate it without verifying its truth. This process explains why altered memories often feel intuitively correct. The Mandela Effect emerges when reconstructive memory, social reinforcement, and schema-driven assumptions combine to create a shared but inaccurate version of reality. Sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis occurs when the brain wakes up before the body completes the transition out of rapid eye movement sleep. During this stage, the body enters a condition called muscle atonia, which prevents movement by inhibiting signals from the motor cortex. This paralysis is normal and necessary during dreaming because it prevents the body from physically acting out dream content. The glitch occurs when consciousness returns, while the body is still locked in this atonia state. The result is full awareness paired with complete immobility. The experience is intensified by the brain's attempt to interpret sensory ambiguity while immobilized. Because the person is awake but cannot move, speak, or shift their position, the brain operates with incomplete sensory data. In this state, the threat detection system becomes highly sensitive. Any vague stimulus, such as a shadow, a sound, or an internal pressure, may be interpreted as a presence. This creates the sensation that something or someone is in the room, often positioned close to the bed. A consistent feature described across cultures is the perception of a dark figure standing near the sleeper. The transcript notes that individuals around the world report nearly identical visuals, despite having no shared cultural influence. This can be explained by a universal cognitive template. When the brain encounters uncertainty in a potentially dangerous context, it defaults to the shape of a human silhouette. This template is efficient for survival because identifying a possible human threat quickly is more useful than interpreting a neutral shape. Sleep paralysis episodes typically last a few seconds to a minute. The paralysis ends when the brain reactivates motor pathways. The hallucinations stop at the same moment because they arise from the combination of REM atonia, partial consciousness, and threat-based pattern completion. Doppelgangers. A doppelganger event occurs when a person perceives another individual as an exact duplicate of themselves, matching facial structure, posture, clothing, or movement pattern. The transcript describes these encounters as moments in which the brain struggles to produce a rational explanation, because normal visual recognition processes fail to categorize what is being seen. The human brain relies on specialized regions, such as the fusiform face area, to identify and differentiate faces. When these systems misfire or encounter unusually similar stimuli, they can produce a false certainty that the observed individual is an identical copy. Perceptual errors can intensify in situations with partial visibility, reflections, or brief glances. The brain completes incomplete information using predictive modeling. If the available visual cues strongly resemble the observer, the predictive system may override missing details and generate the assumption of identity. This can occur with actual lookalikes, distorted reflections, or even peripheral glimpses that the brain reconstructs inaccurately. Historical accounts reinforce the psychological weight of these encounters. The transcript mentions the case of Abraham Lincoln, who reportedly saw two versions of his reflection in a mirror, one normal and one pale. While likely the result of visual fatigue or double reflection, the event demonstrates how easily the brain can produce the illusion of duplication under the right conditions. A contributing factor is the brain's sensitivity to self-recognition. Recognizing oneself is a rare cognitive task that requires precise comparison of features. When this process encounters conflicting signals, the brain may treat the mismatch as two separate entities rather than a distorted version of the self. This interpretation feels threatening because identity plays a central role in cognitive stability. A doppelganger is therefore best understood not as an external duplicate, but as a perceptual conflict in which self-recognition mechanisms misinterpret ambiguous or partially processed visual information. Spontaneous human combustion. Spontaneous human combustion refers to cases in which a person is found severely burned or almost entirely reduced to ash, despite the absence of an identifiable external ignition source. The transcript describes instances where victims were burned far beyond what a typical household fire could produce, yet surrounding objects showed minimal damage. This pattern indicates that the combustion was highly localized, affecting the body but not the environment. One proposed explanation is the wick effect. In this scenario, clothing acts like a wick in body fat, functions as a slow-burning fuel. Once ignited, the fat liquefies and sustains a smoldering burn that can consume large portions of the body. However, this model does not fully account for cases where burning stops abruptly, leaving feet or lower legs untouched. Because the wick effect depends on consistent fuel and heat distribution, partial combustion presents a contradiction. Another factor is the insulating effect of the environment. In some cases, enclosed spaces can trap heat near the body, promoting more complete combustion. Yet this still does not explain why nearby objects, such as furniture or plastic materials, sometimes remain intact or only mildly affected. The transcript notes a case in which a television screen several feet away was warped, but the victim's lower extremities remained unburned. Chemical explanations focus on potential accelerants produced within the body. Certain metabolic conditions can increase flammability, but no known biological process generates enough energy to sustain the extreme temperatures observed. Electrical malfunction, static discharge, and environmental catalysts have also been proposed, but none fit all documented cases. Spontaneous human combustion remains an event where available explanations account for some patterns, but fail to address the full set of observed anomalies, particularly the selective nature of the burn and the minimal surrounding damage. Quantum immortality. Quantum immortality is a theoretical interpretation that emerges from the many worlds formulation of quantum mechanics. In this view, every event with multiple possible outcomes causes reality to branch into separate versions, each representing a different result. When applied to life-threatening situations, the hypothesis proposes that consciousness continues only in branches where survival occurs. From the internal perspective of the observer, death is never experienced because awareness persists exclusively in timelines in which survival continues. The transcript refers to this as a real-life respawn effect. The idea depends on the distinction between external observation and subjective experience. Externally, a person may die in many branches of reality. Subjectively, the versions of consciousness that exist in surviving branches continue without experiencing discontinuity. This produces the illusion of improbable survival when, in fact, many other outcomes have occurred in parallel but are inaccessible to the surviving consciousness. The transcript describes a man who survived a train derailment, a mid-air ejection from an aircraft, multiple vehicular accidents, and finally, a car explosion before later winning the lottery. While these events can be explained individually through probability, the cumulative sequence appears statistically unlikely. The quantum immortality hypothesis would frame this sequence as the observer continuing along a branch in which survival repeatedly occurred. A central problem with the hypothesis is that it interprets survival bias as a physical mechanism rather than a statistical artifact. Humans tend to focus on extreme sequences of improbable events while ignoring the vast number of ordinary outcomes. Additionally, the theory does not address biological limits, such as injuries that would prevent sustained consciousness. Quantum immortality is best understood as a speculative interpretation of branching timelines that highlights the difference between observed probability and subjective continuity rather than a literal mechanism that prevents death. The glitch in the peripheral. Peripheral vision operates using low-resolution processing designed to detect motion and broad shapes rather than detail. The visual cortex allocates most of its resources to the central field of view, leaving the outer field to rely on simplified, fast-processing neural circuits. Because these circuits prioritize speed over precision, the brain frequently fills in missing details through pattern completion. This creates a perceptual rendering effect in which objects appear indistinct or incomplete until the eyes shift toward them and higher resolution processing becomes available. When the brain cannot confidently interpret a peripheral stimulus, it uses predictive modeling based on past experience to estimate what is present. This estimation is useful for detecting threats quickly, but it produces errors when the incoming data is vague or unexpected. As a result, individuals may perceive shapes, shadows, or movements that disappear when examined directly. These perceptual glitches are not hallucinations, but the brain's attempt to maintain a coherent visual field despite limited input. Because peripheral photoreceptors are more sensitive to motion than to color or detail, sudden flickers or minor environmental changes can be amplified into the illusion of something briefly appearing and vanishing. The brain's interpretation shifts immediately once the central visual field engages, replacing the low-fidelity prediction with accurate detail. This rapid correction can create the impression that reality briefly loaded a different image. Phenomenon is most common in low-light conditions, where reduced contrast forces the brain to rely more heavily on inference. The mismatch between the predicted image and the actual visual data produces the sense of a momentary rendering glitch at the edge of awareness. Auditory misfires. Auditory misfires occur when the brain detects patterns in background noise that resemble familiar sounds, most commonly a person's own name. The human auditory system is tuned to identify biologically important signals quickly, and a name is one of the most significant cues because it demands immediate attention. To achieve rapid detection, the brain uses predictive processing, which means it continuously searches for patterns in ambient sound and compares them to stored templates of meaningful auditory cues. When the acoustic input is unclear, such as distant conversation, wind, mechanical hums, or overlapping noises, the brain occasionally interprets random sound fragments as a close match to the internal template of the name. This pattern matching happens automatically and does not require conscious intention. Because the name template is highly sensitive, even partial resemblance can produce the distinct sensation of hearing it spoken. The effect is strengthened by the auditory cortex's reliance on top-down processing. Instead of waiting for perfect clarity, the brain predicts probable meanings and fills in missing information. This allows fast recognition in noisy environments, but also produces false positives when ambient noise aligns coincidentally with expected patterns. Working memory also plays a role. If a person recently heard their name or is engaged in self-referential thought, the activation level of the name template increases. In this state, even weaker auditory cues can trigger the perception. These misfires illustrate how the auditory system balances speed and accuracy. The brain sacrifices precision when scanning for salient signals, resulting in moments where a name appears to be heard clearly despite no external speaker. Body delay glitch. A body delay glitch occurs when the brain initiates an action, but the physical response is noticeably slower than expected. This delay results from temporary inefficiencies in the communication pathways between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. Movement begins with motor commands sent from the motor cortex through the spinal cord to the muscles. For these commands to reach their destination quickly, neurons rely on myelination, which speeds electrical conduction along their axons. When conduction slows, even slightly, the resulting delay becomes perceptible. One cause of slowed conduction is momentary lapses in attention. When cognitive resources are focused on internal thought rather than the external environment, motor planning becomes less precise. The brain may send the command with reduced synchronization across motor neurons, causing the movement to start later or feel uncoordinated. This effect is similar to a temporary reduction in processing bandwidth. Another factor is neuromuscular fatigue. When muscles or motor neurons are tired, they require stronger or more frequent signals to activate. This increases reaction time even when the intention to move is immediate. Fatigue can occur after physical exertion, repetitive tasks, or prolonged inactivity in which muscles temporarily reduce readiness. Sensory processing also influences reaction speed. If the brain is uncertain about incoming sensory data, such as visual or tactile cues, it may delay movement to ensure accuracy. This produces a short hesitation that feels like a lag between intention and action. These body delays are typically brief and harmless, but the contrast between the expected timing and the actual response makes the glitch feel abrupt. The gap between intention and execution is the defining feature of this form of perceptual lag. Memory corruption. Memory corruption occurs when the brain fills in missing or unclear information with invented details that feel accurate. Human memory is not a literal recording of events. Instead, it stores fragments, sensory impressions, emotional tones, and key features. When retrieving a memory, the brain reconstructs the missing portions using logic, pattern recognition, and previously stored knowledge. This reconstruction process is efficient, but introduces errors when the brain generates details that were never part of the original experience. Schemas play a central role in this process. A schema is a mental framework that organizes knowledge about a category of events. When recalling an experience, the brain attempts to match it to the appropriate schema. If fragments are incomplete, the schema supplies typical details automatically. This makes the memory feel complete, even when the inserted information is inaccurate. Because the reconstructed version appears coherent, the person does not perceive the corruption. Emotion also influences detail insertion. Strong emotions increase the likelihood of reconstructive errors by prioritizing the overall meaning of the event rather than its exact specifics. The brain stores the emotional imprint but reduces precision in peripheral details, which later encourages fabricated elements during recall. Repeated recollection further increases corruption. Each time a memory is retrieved, the brain updates it with the reconstructed version rather than the original. Over multiple recalls, these inserted details can become indistinguishable from genuine components. Memory corruption is therefore a product of the brain's attempt to create a stable and continuous narrative, even when the available information is incomplete or ambiguous. The inserted details enhance coherence but reduce accuracy, producing memories that feel real but contain elements that were never present. And if these glitches are happening inside your memory, what other strange malfunctions might be hiding inside your body? To find out, watch the next video. Every strange body glitch, explained in detail.